The galaxy had been quiet for many years. Humanity had spread out to distant stars, building colonies and advancing in ways even their ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. They had faced wars, natural disasters, and many other challenges. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. It all began with the attack. The invaders came out of nowhere fast, ruthless, and without warning. The alien ships descended upon the outer colonies, wiping out entire cities in near hours. No one could understand why. These invaders were not just another enemy. They were a force unlike anything humanity had ever faced. They were powerful, cold, and showed no mercy. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't negotiate. They simply destroyed. On the day the first human colony fell, panic swept through the galaxy. It was hard to believe, at first. How could humanity, which had spent centuries conquering space, be so helpless in the face of this unknown enemy? The destruction was complete. Cities burned, millions of people lost their lives, and the survivors fled to whatever planets they could reach. But those who managed to escape had lost everything: homes, families, friends. The survivors banded together, forming scattered groups across different planets. Many of them held onto a single burning thought: revenge. How could they let this be the end? How could they just accept the destruction of everything they had worked for? The idea of negotiating with these invaders was out of the question. For the survivors, there was only one thing left to do: take back what was lost. But the question was, how? Among the survivors, there were people who had seen the aftermath up close. They were engineers, scientists, soldiers, and civilians. They had witnessed the destruction of everything they knew. Some of them were former diplomats who once believed that war could be avoided at all costs, that peace was always the answer. But those ideas now felt like foolish dreams in the wake of what had happened. One of them, a former military leader, Elena, had seen the devastation firsthand. Her world had been one of the first to fall. She had watched as the invaders tore apart her city, saw the flames rise in the distance as her people were slaughtered. Elena was no stranger to the horrors of war, but this was different. There was no honor in it, no reason behind the violence. It was pure destruction. In the days following the attack, Elena and a group of survivors found refuge on a distant moon. They were just a handful of people at first: families, children, elderly civilians. But as word spread, more people joined them. They were people like Elena, driven by a need to make the invaders pay for what they had done. And soon there were hundreds, then thousands, all united by the same goal. But as the rebellion grew, so did the questions. Could they fight back? Was revenge really the answer? Some still wanted peace. Eric, another survivor, was one of those who believed in the possibility of diplomacy. He was a former ambassador, someone who had worked for years to build bridges between different species in the galaxy. He didn't want to give up hope. He couldn't. "We can't let the violence destroy us," he would say. "We can't. Let them turn us into the same monsters they are." But Elena couldn't see it that way. "They killed millions," she said, her voice sharp. "They didn't give us a choice. There's no peace for us anymore. Only vengeance." The debates were heated. Some believed Eric had a point. If they chose vengeance, would they become no better than the invaders? Would they lose their humanity in the process? Others, however, stood firmly behind Elena. They had lost too much. The idea of sitting down and talking, trying to understand their enemy, was beyond them. These were people who had watched their families die, who had seen their homes turned to ashes. For them, peace seemed like a distant, impossible dream. Elena's group began to take action. They started small, with sabotage missions and guerrilla tactics. They hit alien supply lines, destroyed communication relays, and attacked smaller outposts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And with every attack, the invaders began to take notice. Meanwhile, Eric continued to push for diplomacy. He believed that they could reach a peaceful resolution, that there had to be another way. But as the rebellion continued to grow, he began to feel the weight of his beliefs. There were times when even he wondered if peace was still possible. The attacks kept coming, and each one made it harder to argue for negotiation. The people who joined the rebellion were not just soldiers. They were civilians, everyday people who had nothing left but their desire for revenge. Tariq, a young mechanic, had lost his entire family when the invaders attacked his homeworld. His sister had been killed in the initial strike. His parents had died trying to escape. Tariq wasn't a soldier, but he had a talent for fixing things. He joined the rebellion not because he was trained for war, but because he couldn't sit by while the people who had taken everything from him continued. To roam free. Mia, a nurse, had lost both her husband and her child. She had been working in a medical center when the invasion started, and the destruction that followed was unimaginable. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew how to help people. She joined the rebellion because she knew that if humanity was to survive, they needed every person they could find. And then there was Khalid, a former scientist. He had worked in research labs, studying the very technology the invaders used to destroy humanity. When the war started, he turned his knowledge into a weapon. He designed new ways to fight back new technologies, new strategies. Khalid had always believed in using science for peace, but after the attack, he had turned his mind to vengeance. He became one of the leading figures in the resistance, using his expertise to help humanity rebuild its strength. As the rebellion grew, so did its tactics. They didn't have the military might of the invaders, but they had something else: ingenuity. They used every scrap of alien technology they could find, adapting it to fit their needs. They created new weapons, new armor, new ships. They were learning, improving, and fighting back with everything they had. But despite the victories, despite the progress, one question lingered in the back of their minds. Would it ever be enough? Could they really take back what was lost? And even if they did, would it be worth the cost? As the story began, humanity was at a crossroads. The genocide had shattered their world, and now they had to decide how to move forward. Would they take vengeance, or would they find a way to rebuild through diplomacy? The question would hang over them for a long time. But for now, all they could do was fight back and hope that one day they could reclaim what was rightfully theirs, humanity's. Resistance continued to grow, though they were far from ready to face the full force of the invaders. The rebellion, scattered and disorganized at first, began to take shape. Small victories brought hope, and hope brought more people to their cause. The survivors, once broken and scattered across different planets, now had a reason to fight. They were no longer just hiding or running, they were fighting back. Elena's leadership had become crucial in organizing these scattered forces. She knew the invaders wouldn't give up easily. But what the invaders didn't understand was that humanity, despite all its flaws, was stronger than they could have ever imagined. There was something about the human spirit that, when pushed to the edge, refused to break. Elena began gathering a group of like-minded individuals. They weren't all soldiers or warriors. Some were engineers, some were scientists, and some were civilians who had never held a weapon in their life. But they all had one thing in common: a burning desire for revenge. They had all lost something precious. They had all seen their worlds fall apart. Now, they were going to take that pain and turn it into something powerful. Among the group was a young man named Tariq. He had never been trained for war, but he was a gifted mechanic. He had learned to fix engines and machines from a young age. When his world was destroyed, Tariq was forced to flee, leaving behind his family and his home. It had taken him days to reach the resistance group, but he finally did. And when he arrived, he had only one thing on his mind: to make the invaders pay. Tariq didn't care about the politics or the grand strategies. All he cared about was seeing the people who had destroyed his world pay for their actions. Elena saw potential in him. She saw that his anger, while raw and untrained, could be shaped into something useful. Tariq's skills as a mechanic became invaluable to the resistance. He was able to repair broken weapons, build new machines, and even help design more effective ways to sabotage the invaders' technology. While he was far from being a soldier, he had a different kind of strength, one that would prove just as vital in the war ahead. But then there was Mia, a nurse who had survived the initial attack on her colony. Mia had lost her husband and her child when the invaders came. She had been working in a medical facility at the time, trying to help the wounded when the attack began. It was chaos, people screaming, buildings collapsing, fires everywhere. She had lost track of how many people she tried to save, but in the end, she couldn't save anyone. Her world had been ripped apart, and all she had left were the memories of those she couldn't protect. Mia had joined the resistance not to fight, but to heal. She had no interest in revenge, at least not at first. She simply wanted to help people, to ease their pain. But over time, as the fighting continued and the losses piled up, her attitude began to change. She started to see the bigger picture. The war wasn't just about fighting back, it was about survival. If humanity didn't fight, they would be wiped out. Slowly, Mia's feelings of helplessness turned into anger, and that anger fueled her resolve. She became one of the Resistance's most trusted medics, not just because of her skills, but because she now understood the stakes. She wasn't just healing the wounded anymore. She was fighting for a future. As the rebellion grew stronger, the strategies became more organized. Elena began to lead larger operations, striking at key targets in the invader supply lines. They were still far from being able to take on the full might of the alien forces, but every successful mission brought them closer. The enemy, once so sure of their victory, now had to deal with an unexpected force. The humans were no longer hiding, they were fighting back. One night, Elena and her team launched a daring raid on an alien communications relay. The goal was simple: destroy the relay, disrupt the enemy's communication, and make them question whether their control over the galaxy was as solid as they had believed. The mission was dangerous, and everyone knew it. The invaders had advanced technology, and their security was tight. But Elena's team had something the invaders didn't: determination. They moved quickly, silently, infiltrating the heavily guarded base and planting explosives. The plan worked. The explosion shook the base, and the alien forces were thrown into disarray. For the first time since the genocide, the invaders were forced to deal with real resistance. It wasn't a major victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The relay was down, the invaders were disoriented, and the humans had shown that they could strike at the heart of the enemy's operations. After the raid, morale within the resistance was at an all-time high. Elena knew they couldn't stop. Now, each small victory brought them closer to their ultimate goal: revenge. But as the resistance gained ground, the question of what came next began to loom larger. Could they continue this kind of hit-and-run warfare forever, or would they eventually have to face the full power of the invaders head-on? As the war went on, the resistance learned more about the enemy. They discovered that the invaders, despite their strength, had weaknesses. They were not invincible. They had their own divisions, their own problems. They were not a united force, but a collection of different factions, each with its own goals. Some of the invaders were starting to question the morality of what they had done. Some were even beginning to wonder if humanity was as much a threat as they had been led to believe. This knowledge gave Alana hope. It showed her that the invaders were not unbeatable. They could be broken, just as humanity had been broken. The key was in exploiting their weaknesses. Elena began to focus more on intelligence gathering. They needed to know where the invaders were weakest, where they could strike the hardest. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about victory. Humanity had to win, or they would be wiped out forever. But not everyone in the resistance shared Elena's focus. Eric, the former diplomat who had once called for peace, continued to push for negotiation. He believed that there had to be a way to end the war without more bloodshed. He didn't want to see humanity become as ruthless as the invaders had been. But every time he spoke of diplomacy, Elena's anger flared. How could they talk peace when their people were still being killed? How could they stop fighting when the enemy showed no mercy? Tensions between Elena and Eric began to rise. Eric couldn't understand Alana's thirst for vengeance. He had seen the devastation firsthand, too. He knew the pain, the grief, but he still believed that peace was possible. Elena didn't share that belief anymore. She had seen too much. She had lost too much. And in her heart, she knew that the only way to make sure humanity survived was to fight with everything they had got as the rebellion gained more ground. The question of what came next became more urgent. Elena knew they couldn't keep fighting. Small battles forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the invaders in a decisive battle. And when that day came, there would be no turning back. It would be the end of the war, or the end of humanity. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the resistance grew stronger, and so did the tension among its leaders. Elena, once a military strategist who believed in the power of revenge, now found herself facing a new challenge, a divided resistance. The growing number of people willing to fight had brought with it a growing number of different ideas about how the war should be fought. At the heart of this division was Eric, a former diplomat who had joined the rebellion with a different purpose. Unlike Elena, who was driven by the fire of vengeance, Eric still believed that there was a chance for diplomacy. He was one of the few within the resistance who had not been completely consumed by anger and loss. To him, humanity's future could not be built on a foundation of destruction and violence. He argued that they had to at least try to negotiate with the invaders, to find a way to end the war without the galaxy being torn apart any further. "Can't you see?" Eric said one day during a strategy meeting. "We've already lost so much. The longer we fight, the more we risk losing everything. There's got to be a way to talk to them, to make them understand that we're not the enemy they think we are." But Elena wasn't so sure. She had seen too much. The bloodshed, the destruction. No peaceful negotiation could undo the harm that had already been done. To her, the invaders weren't looking for peace. They had proven that. They didn't care about understanding. They only cared about conquest, about wiping out humanity completely. If they weren't stopped, humanity would never get the chance to rebuild, never get the chance to be more than just survivors of a destroyed galaxy. "No, Eric," Elena said firmly, "there's no negotiating with them. We're not the ones who started this war. We're not the ones who brought this chaos to our doorstep. They're the enemy, and we need to make them pay for what they've done. There is no peace, only vengeance." But Eric's doubts lingered. He had always believed that peace could be found, even in the darkest of times. And as the months dragged on, he began to look for any sign, any opening that might give them the chance to negotiate. With the invaders, Elena, on the other hand, was busy focusing on the practicalities of their rebellion. She knew that they couldn't just keep launching small attacks on alien supply lines forever. The time was coming when they would need to confront the invaders head-on. They couldn't keep hiding in the shadows, striking when it was convenient. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. One evening, while preparing for another raid, Helena was approached by Tariq, the young mechanic who had quickly become one of the rebellion's most valuable members. He had a quick mind, a knack for understanding technology, and a burning desire to fight back. He had been working on improving their weapons and modifying their ships, making them more powerful and efficient. As the rebellion's ability to strike back grew, so did Tariq's importance. "I've been thinking," Tariq said, his voice quieter than usual. "What if we could use their technology against them? I mean, we've been scavenging their weapons and ships for months. We know how their systems work. What if we could turn their own weapons into our advantage?" Elena listened carefully, her mind already racing with possibilities. Tariq's idea was risky, but it had potential. If they could manage to take control of the alien technology and turn it against the invaders, it would give them a fighting chance like never before. They wouldn't just be resisting. They could actually strike at the heart of the alien empire itself. But that would require a level of coordination and planning that they hadn't yet achieved. The problem was the same as always: time. Time was running out. They had already lost so much, and every day they waited brought new risks. The invaders were beginning to regroup, to strengthen their hold over the galaxy. They knew that sooner or later they would have to face the full might of the alien forces. While Elena and her team worked on improving their weapons and ships, Mia, the former nurse, began to see the toll the war was taking on their people. More and more of the rebels were coming to her for medical help, some of them with serious injuries, some with broken spirits. Mia had always been the one who tried to keep people calm, who reminded them that they couldn't just give in to the rage. But even she was starting to feel the weight of the endless battles. The sight of so many wounded, so many lives destroyed, was starting to take its toll. "Mia," one of the resistance fighters said to her one evening as she bandaged the soldiers, "Wound, we can't keep doing this. How much longer can we keep fighting? How much more can we take?" Mia didn't have an answer. She didn't know how much longer they could keep going, but she knew one thing: she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many people were depending on them. Even if she didn't fully believe in Elena's thirst for vengeance, Mia understood the need for survival. If they didn't fight, they would all be wiped out. If they didn't stand up to the invaders, humanity would cease to exist. But Mia also knew that revenge alone wouldn't rebuild the galaxy. It would only leave them with more loss. She started to wonder if there could be another way. Could the resistance find a way to defeat the invaders without losing their humanity in the process? Or were they already too far gone? As the pressure mounted, Elena found herself facing a decision. The next mission was the biggest yet. If they succeeded, they could strike a devastating blow to the invaders' military infrastructure. It would give them the upper hand. But failure would mean the end of the rebellion. Elena knew the risks, and she knew that the outcome would shape everything that came after. She gathered her team together for one last strategy meeting before the mission. Tariq was there, along with Mia and a few other key members of the resistance. "This is it," Elena said, standing at the front of the room. "If we succeed in this mission, we'll have the chance to strike at the heart of the invaders' operations. We'll have a fighting chance to take them down once and for all. But we need to be ready for anything. Failure isn't an option." The tension in the room was palpable. Every person in that room knew how high the stakes were. If they failed, there might be no hope left for humanity. But if they succeeded, the tide of the war could finally turn in their favor. As the team prepared to launch their attack, Eric spoke up. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in it. "Just remember," Eric said, "we're not just fighting to destroy the enemy. We're fighting to rebuild. We're fighting for the future. If we let ourselves be consumed by hatred and revenge, we might win this battle, but we'll lose the war." Elena looked at him, her expression hard. She understood his message, but her heart was set on one thing: victory. The future could wait. For now, they needed to focus on the battle at hand. The time for talking was over. The time for fighting had come. The attack was set. The mission was the most dangerous one they had ever attempted. They knew it could change the course of the war, but no one was certain what the outcome would be. Elena and her team had spent weeks preparing, gathering intel, and planning their strategy. If they succeeded, they would deal a blow to the invaders that they wouldn't easily recover from. But if they failed, it would mean the end of the rebellion. Elena stood at the front of the room, looking over the faces of her team. There was Tariq, the young mechanic whose clever modifications to their weapons and ships had made everything possible. He had transformed scavenged alien tech into tools that gave them an edge against their much stronger enemies. Mia, the nurse who had long ago traded her healing touch for a role in the war effort, stood beside him, her hands steady despite the heavy weight of what lay ahead. She had been the voice of reason through much of their struggle, but now, she was hardened by the years of conflict. The others were just as determined, all ready to fight for the same thing: survival. But none of them could shake the fear that lingered in the back of their minds. The invaders were ruthless, their technology far more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. They had wiped out entire colonies in the blink of an eye, and now the rebellion was their only hope. Elena addressed the group, her voice calm but firm. "This is it. We're going after their central command. If we can take down their leadership, we can cripple their ability to respond. The invaders are organized, but if we disrupt their communication lines, we'll have a chance. We strike hard, we strike fast, and we make sure they know that humanity will not be defeated." The room was silent as everyone nodded in agreement. They all knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. The plan was simple but deadly. They would infiltrate the heart of the invaders' base, a massive fortress located on a heavily guarded planet. The invaders had built their empire by using their superior technology to subdue any species that stood in their way, but their control was not perfect. They had weaknesses. Every system had gaps, and that was where the humans would strike. They would enter the base through a hidden underground tunnel system, bypassing the heavily guarded outer defenses. Once inside, they would plant explosives in key locations to disable the invaders' main power source and communications center. The goal was to cause as much damage as possible without triggering a full-scale war. If they could disrupt the invaders' ability to communicate and coordinate, it would buy them enough time to regroup and plan their next move. The night before the attack, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through the plan again and again. The stakes had never been higher. This was their moment, but it was also their greatest risk. The enemy would be expecting them, and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. If they were caught, it could mean the end of everything they had worked for. Elena was used to making difficult decisions, but this felt different. She wasn't just leading soldiers into battle. She was leading her people into what could be their final stand. The thought weighed heavily on her heart, but there was no other choice. They had to act. Morning came, and the team gathered in the command center. The atmosphere was tense, but focused. No one spoke much. They all knew their roles, and they had trained for this moment for months. Tariq double-checked the modifications he had made to their equipment, ensuring that everything was in working order. Mia made sure the medkits were packed and ready, though she knew she was unlikely to have much time for healing in the midst of the chaos. Finally, Elena gave the order. They boarded their ships and set course for the enemy base. The journey to the planet was long and perilous. The invaders' ships patrolled the skies, constantly scanning for any signs of rebellion. but the humans had learned to be silent in their movements, using their stolen technology to avoid detection. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As they approached the planet, the tension in the air grew thicker. Everyone knew that once they entered the atmosphere, there would be no turning back. Elena gave the signal, and the team descended into the planet's atmosphere, weaving through the enemy's defense systems. They flew low, staying under the radar to avoid detection. The alien ships in orbit were too far away to notice them at first, but the closer they got to the surface, the more vulnerable they became. As they neared the base, they could see the sprawling fortress in the distance. It was an imposing sight, tall, dark, and heavily fortified. The invaders had spent years building it, but it was not invincible. The humans had studied every detail, every weakness, and now they were going to use that knowledge to strike. Elena and her team landed just outside the perimeter of the base, in a hidden valley that was shielded by natural rock formations. The team quickly disembarked, moving swiftly and quietly to the entrance of the underground tunnels. They had to move fast. There was no time to waste. Tariq led the way, guiding them through the maze of tunnels. The air was thick with tension as they advanced deeper into the heart of the base. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, every footstep a reminder that they were deep within enemy territory. They moved cautiously, knowing that any mistake could cost them everything. Maya, carrying a small medical kit, kept close to the rear of the group, ready to help anyone who was injured. Her role in this mission had shifted from healer to soldier. She wasn't used to this kind of warfare, but she had learned to adapt. The rebellion had changed everyone. There was no room for weakness. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the central chamber of the base. The doors were locked, but Tariq quickly hacked into the security system, bypassing the alarms. They were in. But as they stepped into the chamber, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the air. The invaders had figured out they were there. They had walked right into a trap. Before they could react, a loud explosion shook the building. The alarms blared, and red lights flashed in the hallway. They had been spotted. "Elena!" Tariq shouted. The explosives weren't enough to disable their main power source. They're reactivating the core. It was worse than they had feared. The invaders were responding faster than they had anticipated. The countdown to detonation was ticking down, and the humans were trapped in the heart of the enemy's base with no clear escape route. Elena's mind raced. The mission wasn't a failure yet, but it was slipping through their fingers. They had to move fast. The only way out was to make sure the invaders couldn't stop their plans. With no time to lose, Elena gave the order. They had to fight their way out. The battle that followed was chaotic. The humans, armed with the alien weapons they had stolen, fought with everything they had. Elena led the charge, moving quickly through the base, taking out any invaders who stood in their way. Every shot counted. Every move mattered, but as the fighting raged on, it became clear that they weren't going to make it out easily. Invaders had more soldiers, more weapons. They had everything that humanity lacked. But what they didn't have was the same determination, the same hunger for revenge that fueled the humans. As Elena fought, her mind never stopped thinking about the bigger picture. This was it, the final chance to make a real impact. She had to get the explosives to the core. If they could destroy the power source, it would cripple the invaders' ability to fight back. With one last push, Elena reached the heart of the enemy base. She planted the explosives, setting the timer for a few seconds. As the blast echoed through the base, she and her team made their way to the escape route. They had succeeded in their mission. But the war was far from over. The explosion echoed through the base, the walls shaking as the power core detonated. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The alarms silenced, the flashing red lights dimmed, and the sound of battle faded. It was a brief, fleeting silence, but it was enough to let everyone catch their breath. The human rebels had succeeded in their mission. They had struck at the heart of the invaders' empire, disrupting their command and control. But even as the dust settled, they knew this wasn't over. Far from it, Alana's heart was still pounding as she rushed toward the exit. The mission was a success, but it had come at a cost. There were casualties, people who had given their lives for this cause. As she ran, she could feel the weight of their sacrifice pressing on her shoulders. The invaders were not defeated yet, and there was still so much more to do. The war wasn't over. The team moved quickly through the tunnels, their escape route now their only priority. They could hear the invader soldiers rushing through the corridors behind them, their boots echoing off the walls. The explosives had worked, but they had also triggered an immediate counterattack. The invaders weren't going to give up easily. They had the technology, the soldiers, and the will to fight. As they neared the exit, the path became more chaotic. Alana could hear the sounds of laser fire, shouts from the invaders, and the steady thrum of their military forces regrouping. The escape route was supposed to be clear, but it wasn't. The invaders had anticipated something like this. They had already sealed off the tunnels leading to the surface. "We've got to move faster," Alana shouted. "Get to the surface now." The tension was unbearable. Everyone's nerves were on edge. Tariq, who had been vital in their success with the technology and weapons, was at the front, working quickly to disable any alien security systems that blocked their way. Mia, as always, was in the rear, her medical kit ready for whatever injuries might arise. The sound of distant footsteps grew louder. They had to act fast. Suddenly, there was a blast, a massive explosion near the tunnel's entrance. The force sent everyone stumbling, knocking them off their feet. Dust filled the air, and the sound of rubble crashing down echoed in the confined space. The exit was blocked. The way out was no longer clear. "We're trapped," one of the rebels yelled. Panic began to set in. They had come so far, and now they were stuck deep inside the enemy's base, with no clear way out. Alana's mind raced. They had a limited amount of time before the invaders figured out exactly where they were. The longer they stayed in this tunnel, the more likely they were to be captured or killed. "We need to find another way out," Alana ordered, trying to keep her voice steady. Tariq was the first to react. "There's a maintenance hatch further down," he said. "I've seen it in the blueprints. If we can get there, we'll have a way out." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one they had. Alana nodded, rallying the team to follow Tariq. They moved quickly, their footsteps quick and desperate, the air thick with tension. The tunnel grew darker, narrower, and the further they went, the more they could hear the sound of the invaders searching for them. Alana's heart raced as they approached the maintenance hatch. Every second felt like an eternity. If they didn't get out soon, they would be cornered. Finally, Tariq reached the hatch. It was small, hidden behind a section of the wall, just as he had remembered. He quickly worked to open it, his hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. With a hiss of air, the hatch slid open, revealing a narrow escape route that led outside the base. "Go!" "Now?" Alana barked. One by one, the rebels climbed through the hatch and into the open. The outside air felt fresh, even though the ground beneath their feet was unstable. They had made it out, but the danger wasn't over. The moment they stepped outside, they were visible to the enemy. The invaders knew they were there. As they made their way toward their ships, the sounds of pursuing forces grew louder. The battle outside had escalated, and the invaders were determined to stop them. Alana's mind raced. They had to get to their ships and get off the planet fast. "Keep moving," Alana shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. They ran. their feet pounding the ground, their weapons at the ready. The escape wasn't going to be easy. The invaders were closing in. Laser blasts flew past them, narrowly missing their targets. Elena felt a sharp pain in her side, but didn't slow down. There was no time for that. They couldn't afford to lose anyone now. Just as they reached the landing zone, an invader ship appeared overhead. The massive ship hovered above them, its weapons targeting their group. Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. They were out of time, but just as the invader ship began to fire, something unexpected happened. A large explosion rocked the ground, shaking everything in its path. Elena looked up in shock. The explosion had come from one of their own ships. The rebels had set off a chain reaction, blowing up a part of the base in order to cover their escape. The invader ship, caught off guard, had been damaged. The moment of chaos gave them enough time to board their ships. Elena, breathing heavily, climbed into the cockpit and started the engines. As the ship lifted off, she looked down at the surface of the planet, now covered in smoke and debris. They had done it. They had escaped, and their mission had been a success. The invaders' command center was destroyed, their military operations disrupted, but the victory felt hollow. They had lost so much along the way. Some of their best fighters had been killed. The cost of this mission had been high, and there was no guarantee that the damage they had caused would be enough to turn the tide of the war as they soared into the atmosphere. Elena looked at her team. They were all battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were alive. And that, for now, was enough. What's next? One of the rebels asked. Elena didn't have an answer. The war was far from over. The invaders would regroup. They would retaliate, and humanity would need to fight again. But for the first time, Elena allowed herself a small moment of relief. They had struck a significant blow. The invaders were weaker now, and humanity had proven that they could fight back. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity wasn't finished yet. They would continue to fight. They would continue to resist. And if the invaders thought they had won, they had another thing coming. The battle for survival was far from over. The stars outside the ship's viewport flickered as the rebel fleet made its way through the galaxy. The mission had been a success, but the cost was evident on every face aboard. Everyone was tired physically and mentally drained. The past months of war had taken their toll. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet relief. The attack on the invaders' central command had been a major blow, a victory that humanity needed. Yet in the midst of that victory, one question remained. What now? Elena sat alone in her quarters, staring out at the stars. The lights inside the ship were dim, and the quiet hum of the engines was a constant, reassuring presence. But the silence also allowed her to think too much, perhaps. She had led them into this war, had made choices that had brought them here. And while they had succeeded, the rebellion was far from over. There would be no end to the fighting unless they could somehow break the invaders. Hold on the galaxy. The images of the fallen comrades haunted her mind. Faces of those who had died in battle, fighting for this very cause. She could still hear the sounds of the explosion that rocked the base, the screams of those who hadn't made it out. The victory had come at a heavy price. And yet there was no time to mourn. The war had to continue. Elena sighed deeply and stood up, walking to the small communication panel in her quarters. She sent a message to her team, telling them to meet in the war room. There was no time to waste. The invaders were regrouping, and the clock was ticking. Humanity had made a dent in their plans, but they weren't defeated yet. As the team gathered, Elena could see the weariness in their eyes, but there was also something else: determination. They had been through hell and back, and they had come out stronger. There was no backing down now. We've caused them significant damage, Elena began, her voice steady but firm. But we're not finished yet. The invaders are regrouping. They're going to retaliate, and we need to be ready. Tariq was the first to speak, his voice hoarse but sharp. We've seen their military power firsthand. We know what they're capable of. If we want to win, we need a better strategy. We can't keep launching these hit-and-run attacks and hoping for the best. We need to take the fight to their home ground. Mia, the nurse-turned-fighter, was quieter, but her words carried weight. Tariq's right. We need to think long-term. We can't just keep reacting to what they do. We need to plan our next move, carefully look for weaknesses, find cracks in their empire. Elena nodded in agreement. She had been thinking along the same lines. They couldn't keep fighting the same way. The rebellion had to evolve. It had to become more organized, more strategic. We need to hit them where it hurts most. Elena sighed. Their leadership, the heart of their empire. If we can take down their leaders, we can destabilize their forces. The rest will fall apart. But to do that, we need better intel. We need to find out where they are, who they are, and what kind of defenses they have in place. The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed Elena's words. They had all seen the invaders' power, the seemingly insurmountable obstacles they faced. But they had also seen how the invaders underestimated humanity. They had seen that the strength of the human spirit, resilience, ingenuity, and determination was not something to be taken lightly. How do we get this intel? One of the other team members asked. I've been thinking about that. Elena said, we know there are infiltrators within their ranks. We've captured some of their soldiers, and they've given us valuable information. But we need more. We need someone who can get inside their inner circle, someone who can gather the intelligence we need without raising suspicion. The idea hung in the air for a moment. Who could they send? The risk was high, and the mission would require someone with an exceptional skill set, someone who could blend in, learn, and survive under the invaders' radar. I'll do it. Mia spoke up, her voice steady. There was no hesitation in her words. Elena turned to her, surprised. Mia had never been one to volunteer for dangerous missions. Not like this. She had always been the healer, the one who helped others. But something had changed in her over the course of the war. She had become more than just a nurse. She had become a fighter, someone willing to do whatever it took to ensure humanity's survival. Mia, Elena began, her voice gentle. This is a dangerous mission. You're not a soldier. You don't have the training for. I know, Mia interrupted, her eyes meeting Elena's with a fierce determination. But I can do this. I've seen what they've done. I've seen the pain they've caused. I won't sit on the sidelines anymore. If there's a way to bring them down from the inside, I'll find it. I'll get the intel we need. There was a long pause as Elena considered her words. Mia was right. They needed someone who could get close, someone who could infiltrate the invaders' ranks and gather the information that could bring the war to an end. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be without risk. But Mia was right. They couldn't afford to wait for another attack. They needed answers, and they needed them now. All right, Elena said finally. We'll help you prepare. We'll equip you with everything you need to get in and out without being detected. But you need to understand this mission is a one-way trip. If they catch you, there's no going back. Mia nodded, accepting the weight of the responsibility. I understand, but this is what we have to do. The team began preparing for Mia's mission. Tariq worked on a disguise that would help her blend in with the invaders, using their own technology and gear to create something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Mia was outfitted with a communication device that would allow her to send back encrypted messages, though they would have to be careful. Any wrong move could tip off the enemy. The next few days were spent training Mia. She learned the basics of infiltrating enemy lines, how to act like one of them, how to gather information, without drawing attention to herself. It wasn't easy, but Mia was determined. Every time she faced a challenge, she pushed harder. The stakes were too high for her to back down now. When the day of departure finally came, Mia stood at the entrance of the ship, ready to begin her mission. The others were there to see her off, their faces filled with a mixture of pride and fear. Elena approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Be careful," Elena said quietly. "You're the one who can change this. Don't let them win." Mia gave her a small, resolute smile. "I won't." With that, she boarded the shuttle, and the hatch closed behind her. The ship took off, disappearing into the vast expanse of space. Elena watched until it was out of sight, then turned back to the others. "This is it," Elena said, her voice firm. "We wait for Mia's signal. But in the meantime, we prepare for whatever comes next. The invaders are still out there, and we're not done yet." The teen nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The war was far from over, but Mia's mission was their best hope. They could only wait now, and hope that their faith in her was well placed.